See List of Roman legions for a catalogue of known late Republic, early Empire and late Empire legions, with dates in existence, emblem and locations of deployment. A Roman legion was the largest unit of the Roman army, involving from 3,000 men in early times to over 5,200 men in imperial times, consisting of centuries as the basic units. In the early Roman kingdom, the legion may have meant the entire Roman army, but sources on this period are few and unreliable. The subsequent organization of legions varied greatly over time, but legions were typically composed of around 5,000 soldiers, divided during the Republican era into 3 lines of 10 maniples, and from about 100 BC into 10 cohorts. Legions also included a small ala, a cavalry unit. By the 3rd century AD, the legion was a much smaller unit of about 1,000 to 1,500 men, and there were more of them. In the 4th century AD, East Roman border guard legions may have become even smaller. For most of the Roman imperial period, the legions formed the Roman army's elite heavy infantry, recruited exclusively from Roman citizens, while the remainder of the army consisted of auxiliaries, who provided additional infantry in the vast majority of the Roman army's cavalry. The Roman army, for most of the imperial period, consisted mostly of auxiliaries rather than legions. Many of the legions founded before 40 BC were still active until at least the 5th century, notably Legio V Macedonica, which was founded by Augustus in 43 BC and was in Egypt in the 7th century during the Islamic conquest of Egypt. Overview of typical organization and amp strength. Because legions were not permanent units until the Marian reforms, and were instead created, used, and disbanded again, several hundred legions were named and numbered throughout Roman history. To date, about 50 have been identified. The Republican legions were composed of levied men that paid for their own equipment, and thus the structure of the Roman army at this time reflected the society. And at any time there would be 4 consular legions, and in time of war extra legions could be levied. Toward the end of the 2nd century BC, Rome started to experience manpower shortages brought about by property and financial qualifications to join the army. This prompted Consul Gaius Marius to remove property qualifications and decree that all citizens, regardless of the wealth of social class, were made eligible for service in the Roman army, with equipment and rewards for fulfilling years of service provided by the state. The Roman army became a volunteer, professional and standing army which extended service beyond Roman citizens but also to non-citizens that could sign on as auxilia and were rewarded Roman citizenship upon completion of service and all the rights and privileges that entail. In the time of Augustus, there were nearly 50 upon his succession, but this was reduced to about 25 to 35 permanent standing legions, and this remained the figure for most of the empire's history. A legion consisted of several cohorts of heavy infantry known as legionaries. It was almost always accompanied by 1 or more attached units of auxiliaries, who were not Roman citizens and provided cavalry, ranged troops and skirmishers to complement the legion's heavy infantry. The recruitment of non-citizens was rare but appears to have occurred in times of great need. For example, Caesar appears to have recruited the Legio V Alordi mostly from non-citizen Gauls. The size of a typical legion varied throughout the history of ancient Rome, with complements of 4,200 legionaries and 300 equites in the Republican period of Rome. to 5,200 men plus 120 auxiliaries in the imperial period. History. Roman kings in the period before the raising of the Legio and the early years of the Roman Kingdom and the Republic. Forces are described as being organized into centuries of roughly 100 men. These centuries were grouped together as required and answered to the leader who had hired or raised them. Such independent organization persisted until the 2nd century BC amongst light infantry and cavalry, but was discarded completely in later periods with the supporting role taken instead by allied troops. The roles of sentry leader, second in command and standard bearer are referenced in this early period. Much Roman history of the era is shrouded in legend, but it is believed that during the reign of Servius Tullius, the census was introduced. With this, all Roman able-bodied, property-owning male citizens were divided into 5 classes for military service based on the wealth and then organized into centuries as subunits of the greater Roman army, a legio. Joining the army was both a duty and a distinguishing mark of Roman citizenship. During the entire pre-Marian period, the wealthiest landowners performed the most years of military service. These individuals would have had the most to lose should the state have fallen. The first and wealthiest common class was armed in the fashion of the hoplite with spear, sword, helmet, breastplate and round shield. There were 82 sentries of these, of which 2 were trumpeters. Roman soldiers had to purchase their own equipment. The 2nd and 3rd class also acted as spearmen but were less heavily armored and carried a larger oval or rectangular shield. The 4th class could afford no armor, perhaps bearing a small shield and armed with spear and javelin. All 3 of the latter classes made up about 26 centuries. The 5th and final class was composed only of slingers. There were 32 sentries raised from this class, 2 of which were designated engineers. The army officers as well as the cavalry were drawn from leading citizens who enrolled as equestrians. The equites were later placed in smaller groups of 30 that were commanded by decurions. There were 18 centuries of equites. Until the 4th century BC, the massive Greek phalanx was the mode of battle. Roman soldiers would have thus looked much like Greek hoplites. Tactics were no different from those of the early Greeks, and battles were joined on flat terrain. Spearmen would deploy in tightly packed rows to form a shield wall with the spears pointing forwards. They charged the enemy supported by javelin throwers and slingers. The cavalry pursued the enemy, sometimes dismounting to support infantry in dire situations. The phalanx was a cumbersome military unit to maneuver and was easily defeated by mountain tribes, such as the Volscia Samnites, in rough terrain. Early civilian authorities called praetors doubled as military leaders during the summer war season. A declaration of war included a religious ceremony ending with the throwing of a ceremonial javelin into the enemy's territory to mark the start of hostilities. Roman Republic. At some point, possibly in the beginning of the Roman Republic after the kings were overthrown, the legio was subdivided into 2 separate legions, each one ascribed to one of the 2 consuls. In the first years of the Republic, when warfare was mostly concentrated on raiding, it is uncertain if the full manpower of the legions was summoned at any one time. In 494 BC, when 3 foreign threats emerged, the dictator Manius Valerius Maximus raised 10 legions, which Livy says was a greater number than had been raised previously at any one time. Also, some warfare was still conducted by Roman forces outside the legionary structure, the most famous example being the campaign in 479 BC by the clan army of gens Fabia against the Etruscan city of Veii. Legions became more formally organized in the 4th century BC, as Roman warfare evolved to more frequent and planned operations, and the consular army was raised to 2 legions each. In the Republic, legions had an ephemeral existence, except for Legio I to IV, which were the consular armies. Other units were levied by campaign. Rome's Italian allies were required to provide approximately 10 cohorts to support each Roman legion. In the middle of the Republic, legions were composed of the following units: equites. The cavalry was originally the most prestigious unit, where wealthy young Roman men displayed their skill and prowess, laying the foundation for an eventual political career. Cavalry equipment was purchased by each of the cavalrymen and consisted of a round shield, helmet, body armor, sword and one or more lancers. The cavalry was outnumbered in the legion. In a total of circa 3,000 men, the legion only had around 300 horsemen, divided into 10 units of 30 men. These men were commanded by decurions. In addition to heavy cavalry, there would be the light cavalry levied from poor citizens and wealthy young citizens not old enough to be in the hastati equites. In battle, they were used to disrupt and outflank enemy infantry formations and to fight off enemy cavalry. In the latter type of engagement, they would often dismount some or all of the horsemen to fight a stationary battle on foot, an unusual tactic for the time, but one that offered significant advantages in stability and agility in a time before stirrups. The Ville Eats. The Ville Eats were mainly poorer citizens who could not afford to equip themselves properly. The primary function was to act as skirmishers, javelin throwers, who would engage the enemy early in order either to harass them or to cover the movement of troops behind them. After throwing the javelins, they would retreat through the gaps between the maniples, screened from the attack of the enemy by the heavy infantry lines. With a shortage of cavalry in the army of the early to mid-Republican army, the Ville Eats were also used as scouts. They did not have a precise formal organization or formation. Heavy infantry. This was the principal unit of the legion. The heavy infantry was composed of citizen legionaries that could afford the equipment composed of an iron helmet, shield, armor and pilum, a heavy javelin whose range was about 30 meters. After 387 BC, the preferred weapon for the hastati and principes was the gladius, a short sword. The hobnailed sandals were also an effective weapon against a fallen enemy. Prior to the Marian reforms, the heavy infantry was subdivided, according to experience, into 3 separate lines of troops. The hastati consisted of raw or inexperienced soldiers, considered to be less reliable than legionaries of several years' service. The hastati were placed at the front for several reasons. One reason is the city of Rome could ill afford to lose experienced soldiers, so they put the greenest soldiers at the front. If they survived, the hastatitus would gain invaluable experience. Another reason is if the newest soldiers succumbed to battle nerves and broke and tried to run, then there were experienced soldiers behind them to stiffen the resolve. The principes. These were the more experienced soldiers, often better equipped than the hastati, and having more experience on the battlefield. They would take up the second line in the battle in the event the hastati failed or fled. They were the second wave in an early Republican legion before the military reforms of Marius. The triae were the veteran soldiers, to be used in battle only in extreme situations. They rested one knee down when not engaged in combat. The triae served primarily as reserves of barrier troops designed to backstop the hastati and principes, and were equipped with long hastae rather than the pilum and gladius. Thus armed, they fought in a phalanx formation. The sight of an advancing armored formation of triae legionaries frequently discouraged exultant enemies in pursuit of retreating hastati and principes troops. Ad triarios readers. To fall back upon the triae was a Roman idiom, meaning to use one's last resort. Each of these 3 lines was subdivided into chief tactical units called maniples. A maniple consisted of 2 sentries and was commanded by the senior of the 2 centurions. At this time, each century of Hastati and Principes consisted of 60 men. A century of Triae was 30 men. These 3,000 men, together with about 1,200 Ville Eats and 300 cavalry, gave the mid-Republican legion a nominal strength of about 4,500 men. Late Republic. See also List of Roman legions for details of notable late Republican legions. See also subunits of the Roman legion. The Marian reforms enlarged the centuries to 80 men, and grouped them into 6 century cohorts. Each century had its own standard and was made up of 10 units of 8 men who shared a tent, a millstone, a mule and cooking pot. Following the reforms of the general Marius in the 2nd century BC, the legions took on the second, narrow meaning that is familiar in the popular imagination as close-order citizen heavy infantry. At the end of the 2nd century BC, Gaius Marius reformed the previously ephemeral legions as a professional force drawing from the poorest classes, enabling Rome to field larger armies and providing employment for jobless citizens of the city of Rome. However, this put the loyalty of the soldiers in the hands of the general rather than the state of Rome itself. This development ultimately enabled Julius Caesar to cross the Rubicon with an army loyal to him personally and effectively end the Republic. The legions of the late Republic and early Empire are often called Marian legions. Following the Battle of Vercelli in 1001 BC, Marius granted all Italian soldiers Roman citizenship. He justified this action to the Senate by saying that in the din of battle he could not distinguish Roman from ally. This effectively eliminated the notion of allied legions. Henceforth all Italian legions would be regarded as Roman legions, and full Roman citizenship was open to all the regions of Italy. At the same time, the 3 different types of heavy infantry were replaced by a single, standard type based on the Principes, armed with 2 heavy javelins called pila, the short sword called gladius, chainmail, helmet and rectangular shield. The role of allied legions would eventually be taken up by contingents of allied auxiliary troops, called auxilia. Auxilia contained specialist units, engineers and pioneers, artillerymen and craftsmen, service and support personnel, and are irregular units made up of non-citizens, mercenaries and local militia. These were usually formed into complete units such as light cavalry, light infantry of elites, and laborers. There was also a reconnaissance squad of 10 or more light mounted infantry called speculators who could also serve as messengers or even as an early form of military intelligence service. As part of the Marian reforms, the legion's internal organization was standardized. Each legion was divided into cohorts. Prior to this, cohorts had been temporary administrative units or tactical task forces of several maniples, even more transitory than the legions themselves. Now the cohorts were 10 permanent units, composed of 6 sentries and in the case of the first cohort 12 sentries, each led by a centurion assisted by an optio. The cohorts came to form the basic tactical unit of the legions. Ranking within the legion was based on length of service, with the senior centurion commanding the first century of the first cohort. He was called the primus pilus, and reported directly to the superior officers. All career soldiers could be promoted to the higher ranks in recognition of exceptional acts of bravery or valor. A newly promoted junior centurion would be assigned to the 6th century of the 10th cohort and slowly progressed through the ranks from there. Every legion had a large baggage train, which included 640 mules just for the soldiers' equipment. To keep these baggage trains from becoming too large and slow, Marius had each infantryman carry as much of his own equipment as he could, including his own armor, weapons around 15 days' rations, for about 25 to 30 kilograms of load total. To make this easier, he issued each legionary a cross stick to carry the loads on the shoulders. The soldiers were nicknamed Marius's mules because of the amount of gear they had to carry themselves. This arrangement allowed for the possibility for the supply train to become temporarily detached from the main body of the legion, thus greatly increasing the army's speed when needed. A typical legion of this period had 5,120 legionaries as well as a large number of camp followers, servants and slaves. Legions could contain as many as 6,000 fighting men when including the auxiliaries, although much later in Roman history the number was reduced to 1,040 to allow for greater mobility. Numbers would also vary depending on casualties suffered during a campaign. Julius Caesar's legions during his campaign in Gaul often only had around 3,500 men. Tactics were not very different from the past, but their effectiveness was largely improved because of the professional training of the soldiers. After the Marian reforms, and throughout the history of Rome's late republic, the legions played an important political role. By the 1st century BC, the threat of the legions under a demagogue was recognized. Governors were not allowed to levy the provinces with the legions. When Julius Caesar broke this rule, leaving his province of Gaul and crossing the Rubicon into Italy, he precipitated a constitutional crisis. This crisis and the civil wars which followed brought an end to the Republic and led to the foundation of the Empire under Augustus in 27 BC. Early Empire. See List of Roman legions of the early Empire. See also subunits of the Roman legion. Generals, during the recent Republican civil wars, had formed their own legions and numbered them as they wished. During this time, there was a high incidence of Gemina legions, where two legions were consolidated into a single organization. At the end of the civil war against Mark Antony, Augustus was left with around 50 legions, with several double counts. For political and economic reasons, Augustus reduced the number of legions to 28. Besides streamlining the army, Augustus also regulated the soldiers' pay. At the same time, he greatly increased the number of auxiliaries to the point where they were equal in number to the legionaries. He also created the Praetorian Guard along with a permanent navy where served the liberti, or freed slaves. The legions also became permanent at this time, and not recruited for particular campaigns. They were also allocated to static bases with permanent castra legionaria. Augustus's military policies proved sound and cost-effective, and were generally followed by his successors. These emperors would carefully add new legions as circumstances required or permitted, until the strength of the standing army stood at around 30 legions, with each legion having 5,120 legionaries, usually supported by an equal number of auxiliary troops. The total force available to a legion commanded during the Pax Romana probably ranged from 11,000 downwards, with the more prestigious legions and those stationed on hostile borders or in restive provinces tending to have more auxiliaries. Some legions may have even been reinforced at times with units making the associated force near 15,000–16,000, or about the size of a modern division. Throughout the imperial era, the legions played an important political role. Their actions could secure the empire for a usurper or take it away. For example, the defeat of Vitellius in the Year of the Four Emperors was decided when the Danubian legions chose to support Vespasian. In the empire, the legion was standardized, with symbols and an individual history where men were proud to serve. The legion was commanded by a legatus, a legate. Aged around 30, he would usually be a senator on a 3-year appointment. Immediately subordinate to the legate would be 6 elected military tribunes, 5 would be staff officers and the remaining 1 would be a noble, heading for the Senate. There would also be a group of officers for the medical staff, the engineers, record keepers, the praefectus castrorum and other specialists such as priests and musicians. Late Empire. In the later Roman Empire, the number of legions was increased and the Roman army expanded. There is no evidence to suggest that legions changed in form before the Tetrarchy, although there is evidence that they were smaller than the paper strengths usually quoted. The final form of the legion originated with the elite legions Palatini created by Diocletian and the Tetrarchs. These were infantry units of around 1,000 men rather than the 5,000, including cavalry, of the old legions. The earliest legions Palatini were the Lanciarii, Joviani, Herculiani and Vitenses. The 4th century saw a very large number of new, small legions created, a process which began under Constantine II. In addition to the elite Palatini, other legions called comitatenses and pseudo-comitatenses, along with the auxilia palatina, provided the infantry of late Roman armies. The Notitia Dignitatum lists 25 legions Palatini, 70 legions comitatenses, 47 legions pseudo-comitatenses and 111 auxilia palatina in the field armies, and a further 47 legions in the frontier armies. Legion names such as Honoriani and Gratianenses found in the Notitia suggest that the process of creating new legions continued through the 4th century rather than being a single event. The names also suggest that many new legions were formed from vexallations from old legions. In addition, there were 24 vexallations Palatini, 73 vexallations comitatenses, 305 other units in the Eastern Limitanae and 181 in the Western Limitanae. According to the late Roman writer Vegetius de Re Militari, each century had a ballista and each cohort had an onager, giving the legion a formidable siege train of 59 ballistae and 10 onagers, each manned by 10 librators and mounted on wagons drawn by oxen or mules. In addition to attacking cities and fortifications, these would be used to help defend Roman forts and fortified camps as well. They would even be employed on occasion, especially in the later empire, as field artillery during battles or in support of river crossings. Despite a number of reforms, the legion system survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and was continued in the Eastern Roman Empire until around 7th century, when reforms begun by Emperor Heraclius to counter the increasing need for soldiers around the empire resulted in the theme system. Despite this, the Eastern Roman, Byzantine armies continued to be influenced by the earlier Roman legions, and were maintained with similar level of discipline, strategic prowess, and organization.